The Palestinians are still waiting for a state of their own. It's been 45 years since Israel's illegal occupation of their territories, 19 years since the start of the so-called peace process. But there is no peace and there is no process.
Hello and welcome to The Cafe. I'm Mehdi Hassan and this week we're in Ramallah, the cultural, commercial and political hub of the occupied West Bank.
It's a boom town with big construction projects, fancy foreign cars and fine houses, funded by international aid and guilty consciences. There's a grand presidential palace that would make a sultan blush, but it sits just round the corner from poverty-stricken refugee camps and Israel's grotesque wall.
These days, the Palestinians aren't fighting the Israelis, they're fighting each other. The occupied territories are split between the Islamists of Hamas, who rule Gaza, and the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority that runs the West Bank.
Many accuse the PA and its president Mahmoud Abbas of being Israeli stooges, and their mismanagement of the economy and constant postponing of elections has made them deeply unpopular. So will there be a Palestinian Arab Spring?
And what is the solution to the conflict? One state, two states, or even three states? Let's find out inside the cafe.
Joining us in the cafe today are Samir Abu Ayeshe, a university professor in Nablus who served as Minister of Planning in the Hamas-led unity government. He spent time inside Israeli prisons and says now might be the time to abandon the stalled peace process. Nabil Shath is a senior member of the ruling Fatah party and a former Palestinian Authority foreign minister. He's currently responsible for the PLO's foreign relations, including peace talks with Israel. Mohammed Shataya is the head of the Palestinian Economic Council for Development and Reconstruction. Shataya is close to President Mahmoud Abbas and is considered a possible successor. Diana Boutou is a former legal advisor and spokeswoman for the PLO, who now supports a one-state solution. She believes the Palestinian Authority doesn't represent the Palestinian diaspora. Lina Al-Safin is a blogger and political activist who writes for the Electronic Intifada website. She's an outspoken critic of the Palestinian Authority, which she sees as being complicit in Israel's occupation. Khalid al-Sabawi is a Palestinian businessman who runs a company that invests in geothermal energy. Sabawi believes corruption is rife inside the Palestinian Authority and says foreign aid has stunted an independent Palestinian economy.
Thank you very much, all of you, for joining me here in the cafe in Ramallah. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to kick off by asking a question to all of you about the peace process, because everyone who comes to Ramallah talks about peace and the process. From where I'm sitting, there doesn't seem to be either. And therefore, what is the point of this Palestinian Authority that we hear so much about? Nabil, what is the purpose? Whose interest does it serve?
The Palestinian Authority was created on the basis that this peace process will end by a maximum in 5 years. So it was to be the preparation for a state to come, but there is no state. And that authority has assumed many of the functions of a state, but really this is not our goal, it is not our target, it's not our objective. It's an intermediary stage that have stayed too long.
So then what's the purpose of it? Why not shut up shop? Why not say close for business? There is no need for a PA. Israel, over to you.
That's not as easy as you put it, because today there are 3.5 million Palestinians who are either work for the authority, there are some 150,000 employees of the authority, or somehow or another benefit from the authority's services. This cannot possibly now be replaced by the Israelis. If you look at the record of the Israelis during their 20 years of occupation before the authority came, they built not a kilometer of road, they did not add one hospital room or one classroom, and they were making money on the taxes they collected from the West Bank and Gaza, spending it on their army occupying the territory.
Okay. Lina, whose interests do you think the PA serves? You're someone who lives under its purview here in the West Bank. What do you make of it?
I think the PA only serves a very small elite of Palestinian society. And from my perspective, viewing the 20 years of the peace process, I see it as a form of disguising the Israeli takeover of even more land, a form of disguising the Israeli policy of occupation even more. We have more settlements, we have more settlers, there's the apartheid wall, there's the siege on Gaza. There's a lot of different phases of occupation that were present that the PA, I would say, would help to establish and maintain with the full blessing of Israel.
Mohammed, you're with Fatah. When you hear young Palestinians like Lena saying this, how does that make you feel?
It makes me feel very good because we're online. We don't want to sink in the status quo. The status quo is a situation in which Israel is enjoying its occupation. This occupation is profitable, and therefore Israel is actually using the peace process as a cover under which is implementing all the colonization
program. Do you feel used by the Israelis? As someone who's
the
involved?
issue is not used. The issue is a matter of...
Your word.
The issue is not who is used and who is not. The issue is there is a situation in which there is a symmetrical relationship between us and Israel, where the weaker party, they're the occupiers. We have to make occupation costly. We have to increase the cost of occupation. We have to make occupation not profitable. And I think we all agree that continuation of the Palestinian Authority, the way it functions today, every single day that comes, it doesn't really serve the national interest of the Palestinian people. And therefore, we have to change the function of the authority.
Khalid, when you listen to that, does that make you feel optimistic that actually the PA gets that it needs to change?
Yeah, the last sentence that Dr. Stayes stated is true. I agree with it. However, there is a point that I respectfully disagree with. The Palestinian Authority today has essentially become a subcontractor of the Israeli occupation. When Oslo was created in 1993, and Israel was bearing the economic burden of occupation, it was very expensive. But when the Palestinian Authority was created, it essentially started policing the Palestinian cities. But who paid for the bill? All the donor states, the United States, Canada, and the entire international community. But Israel fully maintained its occupation. Israel still controlled borders, airspace, water, and pretty much all aspects of life for the Palestinian people, but brought in the Palestinian Authority to manage these cities. So it's been about 20 years of occupation management. And that's taken us back significantly. And what it's created is this entity that's become, focused more on its self-interest than the interests of the Palestinian people.
Well, let me ask you, Samir, you served in a Hamas-led unity government back in 2006. And when you listen to Khalid say that the PA, whether it's Hamas or Fatah, is subcontracting for Israel, do you agree with that assessment? Were you subcontracting for Israel when you were in government?
Well, we were running the day-to-day life of the Palestinians. But we have also to look at the global picture. We are now stuck at the middle of a process which is no process, at the middle of peace where there is no peace, and therefore we have to do something. We have to review our situation. We have to come up with strategic options. We have to look at other alternatives. Otherwise, we will be losing every day and every day and every day.
Diana, you were an advisor to various Palestinians, the President Abbas, Prime Minister Fayyad, Yasser Arafat back in the day. You were very well known as a negotiator. We used to see you on our TV screens. You've cut all your ties since then. Why? But you were involved in the governance process.
Absolutely. And I began to see that we were heading down a process where the interest was in keeping the process going and not actually exiting it. There was no alternative strategy as to how to liberate Palestine. The focus became entirely on the operations of the Palestinian Authority. And I wish that the Palestinian Authority was as benign or as benevolent as it's been described. We're now facing a situation in which Palestinians are committing human rights against fellow Palestinians for the interest solely to maintain relations with Israel and to maintain relations with the international donor community.
Diana and Khalid both raised human rights. Nabil, the Palestinian Authority, correct me if I'm wrong, throws journalists and bloggers in jail, has been accused of torture by Human Rights Watch. Recently, I believe, an official was thrown out of a third-floor window. That's the accusation. It's not a great human rights record that you have, do you?
Well, I think there are human rights violations, but I think the accusations are over-exaggerated. Now, there are two factors. There's a factor relating to Israel, but there's a factor relating to the division between the West Bank and Gaza and the problems of human rights violations caused by that division. And also, I would like to correct a little bit the history that my colleagues here are mentioning. There's a total, as if they were born just 10 years ago. This authority went into a very serious period of confrontation, military confrontation with the Israelis, the Intifada, which was very, very costly to us and to the Israelis as well. So the situation was not always like this. There was a decision that we could not continue the kind of struggle that we were involved in with the Israelis. Having stopped the military confrontation, we tried other strategies and alternatives, such as nonviolent struggle, such as international activism leading to boycott of Israelis and Israeli goods and of seeking membership. It was not just a question of bargaining our life and commissioning ourselves to protect the Israelis. That's not the issue.
There has always been a little bit of this idea that somehow the only way the process can work is if Israel feels safe. In other words, Palestinians have come to reject this idea that military occupation should be costly. The Palestinian Authority has made it a cost-free occupation, not just in terms of the financial issue, but in terms of the larger issue. We're now coming and denouncing anything that happens against Israel, not making the link between Israel's lack of security and our lack of freedom. That is the problem.
That is the was not the objective.
It's not necessarily a question of objectives, but that's what the situation
I
has
think we
turned
all
out to
agree
be.
to
Dr. Nabil was saying, if the intentions of the Palestinian leadership was good, I will respond by saying the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that pretty much summarizes the Palestinian leadership. It hasn't served to push Palestinian liberation forward whatsoever. As it stands today, the Palestinian Authority is completely anti-democratic. It has no mandate from the Palestinian people. The people that go negotiate with Israel, the Palestinian leadership that goes to negotiate with Israel, has no mandate from the Palestinian people. They do not represent them.
What's your mandate? You go to negotiate with the Israelis often. What's your democratic mandate?
No, that's not the issue.
But I'm making it an issue. What is your democratic mandate?
The issue is Israel. And
Okay. Mohammed.
Look, Palestinian leadership, represented by the PLO, is the party that is negotiating with Israel, and it has all the legitimacy that it needs. It is not the Palestinian Authority who is negotiating with Israel.
Well, let's talk specifically about the Palestinian Authority. President Abbas, correct me if I'm wrong, his term expired 3 years ago.
Yeah, but
and he's still president, ruling by a decree. How is that not a dictatorship?
That's fine. We are calling for immediate elections. President Abbas has called for elections more than once. We are waiting for a national consensus on and agreement on elections to take place in all Palestinian territories, West Bank, Gaza, including Jerusalem.
Leader.
Unfortunately, things are not going the way we want.
Leader,
now,
and then I'll come to Samir.
I would bring the conversation back to the root problem of the PA, which claims that it serves the Palestinian national interest when it doesn't even represent the majority of the Palestinians. Palestine for me is not the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Palestine for me is the whole Palestine, including Gaza, Akka, Haifa, and we still have the 6 million refugees in the refugee camps in the surrounding countries.
I've got to ask one question. When you look at the Gaza Strip, where Hamas is in charge, they've not done a much better job than Fatah, have they? Their human rights record is equally poor. You would accept that point?
Yeah. Well, whoever is doing something wrong in this file has to be pointed out. We have seen incidents here and in Gaza, violating basic human rights. We have to be fair and say that this is wrong. We have to stop this and open a new chapter for our internal relations.
Jan, I've met people in my brief stay in Ramallah who say to me that we've tried Fatah, we've tried Hamas, we don't like either. Is that a growing view, that there's disillusionment with all of the people in charge?
Well, certainly among the people that I know, that it's been demonstrated that people are just completely unhappy with what's gone on in Gaza, with what's gone on in the West Bank, the human rights abuses. And we keep talking as though this is somehow an interim government. But this is going to be the government that's going to one day run the supposed state. And if this is the model, I don't want to have anything to do with it, because this is going to be a very repressive model. What I want in a Palestinian leader is somebody who's going to stand up and confront Israel and protect my rights, not do the opposites. This is the problem with the Palestinian
Authority. If I could add, that leader that Diana's talking about, it doesn't exist, in the SUVs and the bulletproof, SUVs with 4 or 5, staff members following him around everywhere, as most PA officials do. And that goes, again, to the heart of what the PA has become. It hasn't become an organization that represents the Palestinian people.
Do you believe it's not just, people say this to me, I'm wondering your view, do you believe it's not just repressive, but there's corruption here? There's lots of
it has a long history of corruption. There's no question. That's been well documented.
Nabil, we look at Palestinian officials. You guys live good lives. Is that fair? Compared to the people you're ruling over?
We are having a better life.
Better lives than other Palestinians?
Obviously, the leadership, at least any person in the leadership, will get a salary equivalent to that of a director general of a government authority, which is a salary that is at least double the average salary that any employee takes, or even 3 times that. But it's not 10 times that. It's not 100 times that, like in all our neighboring countries.
And a corruption problem? Do you have a corruption problem?
And I think it's always extremely exaggerated. We have it, obviously we have it. But there have always been efforts to combat it. And that effort started during Arafat's time, not only this time.
Well, let me ask Mohammed a question. In a brief drive I had around Ramallah last night, I came across the presidential palace. That's a rather big building. How much did that cost to build?
Your question is very exaggerated because
Tell me.
It is a very simple administrative building that did
Really?
cost. You're asking me, you want to answer or you don't?
Please.
It's a very administrative building. It did cost us less than $1.5 million, which is really nothing compared to any other building in town. The point here is that I don't know what are you hinting at. If
I'm
you are
hinting at the fact that
if
the
you are
Palestinian
hinting
Authority
at,
seems to spend a lot of aid money on things that aren't necessarily necessary.
First of all, this is not money that is aid money.
Okay.
Second important issue, this is any respected authority needs to have a functioning space in order for it to function well, whether it is a guest house or what is the most important thing, the money that is donated by the international community to the Palestinian Authority, it all goes to infrastructure.
What I don't understand is you say $1.5 million is a small amount for a big building, and yet in June you couldn't pay your employees $160,000.
Yeah, but this is
how is that?
No, this is
Absolutely.
look at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
Listen,
If I can add.
no, but before you add, let me tell you one thing. The place. The offices of the president where he functions today is the old muqata'a that was built in 1927. So therefore there isn't really, if you go to al-muqata'a today, there isn't an office space for people to work in. So all what we are building is office space.
What
That's
you
all.
mentioned was
It's just office space.
to the point. The salaries that were discussed for the Palestinian Authority, the buildings that are being built for the Palestinian Authority are paid for by the United States, by the international community, and the donor states. And this is a good transition, I think, to the economic discussion,
Please.
which is extremely important. As it stands today, about 40% of the GDP of the Palestinian territories is accounted for by donor aid. The Palestinian people, as a result of Oslo and the Palestinian Authority, have become the highest recipients of foreign aid in the world per capita. In addition to that, there's an enormous dependence on the Israeli occupation. 95% of our energy comes from Israel, 80% of our imports come from Israel, 90% of our exports go towards Israel. The Palestinian economy is a
So when people
sub-economy
say
of
to
Israel.
you, look at Ramallah, it's booming, what do you say to them?
It's driven by donor aid.
No,
It is an
no.
illusion.
Is it a bubble?
It is a bubble.
It's a bubble.
Absolutely, it's a bubble.
Without
any
doubt,
doubt, it's
I
a
will
bubble.
come back to you, Mohammed. Samir's waiting, and then I will come back to you.
Okay.
It's not real, development. I would imagine that most of the aid is given, first of all, for running, the public sector. And second, when there is developmental fund, I can just take an example of the largest donor, which is the EU. Most of the money goes not specifically to develop the productive sector. Only 1.7% of the donations for development for the Palestinians goes to the productive sector, including, for example, agriculture and industry and trade and tourism. Only 1.7. This
Mohammed,
is just an
you wanna
example
touch
of
on
that.
that? I wanna bring
It's
in
just an
Diaz,
example.
The situation as is, this is very unusual. This Palestinian economy is dependent upon Israel. It's a besieged economy, and it is not really functioning within its own sphere, and it is functioning under occupation that is heavily dependent upon Israel. We know all this. The question is, what sort of alternatives do we have? The Israeli occupation is not allowing us to generate electricity. The Israeli occupation is not allowing us to dig water wells. So the situation is that we don't live under normal conditions in order for our economy to function in the best shape possible. So
Mohammed
that
says
is the situation.
we don't live under normal conditions, so it's unfair to kind of exaggerate the problems of the economy.
One thing that is amazing about the Palestinian people is their resilience. And the idea that somehow we are helpless is offensive to me. And the idea that somehow we have to remain dependent on the donors is offensive to me. Rather than this money being used to build up more buildings and build up more infrastructure and doing all that stuff, we need to be investing in our people. We need to be investing in a sustainable economy. We need to be investing in products that will make us independent from Israel, not dependent upon Israel. When you see buildings going up, including the presidential compound, I don't care how much it costs, that look ostentatious and ridiculous, then it drives the message home that everybody around should be acting in the same way.
And what about Nabil's point that there are charges of corruption that we talked about earlier, they're exaggerated? Do you agree with that?
I think on that he's actually right. Look, the issue of corruption was an issue that Palestinians themselves raised back in the 90s. And it was Israel and the European Union that very quickly shoved it under the rug. But suddenly, after the Second Intifada, in 2002, when the authority was under attack and when Israel wanted to dismantle the authority, suddenly the charges of corruption became very politicized, and hence it went forward.
I'd like to add something, and so the viewers can understand the problem of donor dependency, is that it compromises the political and economic independence of the Palestinian people. So if the Palestinian people take an independent road or elect their own government, as they eloquently did in 2006 with an 80% voter turnout, then the donor aid was cut off, and the Palestinian people were punished for exercising their democratic right. Exactly, for being democratic. And just one small point, the situation now, economically, is far worse than it was before. The Palestinian Authority is forcing Palestinian banks to give 50% of their deposits as loan facilities to the Palestinian people. Why? Because OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is an American foreign policy organization, came and provided loan guarantees for Palestinian banks for a push to drive the Palestinian economy to be more debt-based. Now, debt has accumulated to $3 billion consumer debt for the Palestinian people. It's even higher. That proves my point even more, that the Palestinian Authority has created further dependent victims of the Palestinian people, as opposed to confront the Israeli occupation.
You want to make a brief point, and I want to finish this off.
I just want to break things down.
Then we'll finish with you.
Just to break things down in very simple terms, it doesn't make sense to me as a 21-year-old Palestinian to see all these grandeurs and illusions of statehood from state-building institutions, from however ostentatious the buildings are, how much they cost. It doesn't make sense to me if we're still under occupation.
We're going to come to that in part two. We're going to talk much more about that. Before we finish this part, Nabil, you wanted to come back in and respond to some of the points.
The situation of dependence on foreign aid, you totally forget the real culprit. The highest percentage per capita of foreign aid in any country in history over the last 50 years has been Israel and not the Palestinians. But you, not only you, the foreign donors forget that. The Israelis try to ignore
Why are we comparing ourselves? Why are we dropping the bar so low and comparing ourselves to the most dependent state?
They are paying us because they are causing our pain. Hold on.
It's like a bribe.
They are paying us
It's a bribe to keep us quiet.
Our occupation.
The donor money to the Palestinian people.
They are the cause of our dissolution. They are the cause of building the walls and for the international community to accept that. Because they are besieging Gaza and the international community accepts that.
When the international community
has
comes
to
and
pay
pays
for
the
it.
salaries of the Palestinian people or paves the road to the checkpoint.
We're not begging from people. They are paying a tax that they should pay.
It is the biggest bribe in history to an entire people
it's
collectively to keep them quiet.
Once you are ready to fight, let's go and fight. But you are not ready to fight. We fought for years.
Your point to try to compare us to Israeli donor dependence does not further your point whatsoever.
There's completely different ways of fighting.
Yes, we are. The president goes around the world begging for money to pay for the salaries of Palestinian Authority employees, not to further the rights. No. We need a strategy. We need a movement. We need a PA. We need a PA that represents the Palestinian people, that's democratically elected.
On money side. So if the president doesn't go to Saudi Arabia on over asking the international community for help, which is for us not begging, which is an international obligation.
How about this?
This is an international obligation that the international community has guaranteed, a political agreement that was supposed to end by May 4th, 1999, and that this Palestinian Authority should have become a state.
How about this?
We're going to continue this discussion in part two, this very discussion that you've raised. I'm going to have to bring an end. We'll continue this in just a moment. I'm going to wrap up this half. Join us in part two. We're going to be talking about what the future of this conflict is. Is it a one-state solution, a two-state solution, or even a three-state solution? Join us for part two. Welcome back to the cafe here in Ramallah. We're having a very lively debate about the future of a Palestinian state, if there is one, and Palestinian governance and human rights. Khalid Al-Sabawi has left us, and we're joined now by Hafiz Omar, who is a young graphic artist and a political and social activist. Hafiz, I just want to, before we continue on the discussion, you were involved in some of the protests against a visit of the Israeli Deputy Prime Minister about governance and human rights in general. Tell us what happened to you at that protest.
When we were demonstrating.
Peacefully.
Peacefully, I was holding a black card demanding the Palestinian leadership to go back to the Palestinian people. And I was beaten by an undercover police with a walkie-talkie on my head, and I was bleeding at the demonstration.
Mohammed, when you hear that, what do you say to Hafiz when he says Palestinian police are beating me? Forget the Israelis, I'm being repressed by the Palestinians.
Under any circumstances, I don't accept this. This freedom of speech and expression is something that we should all fight for. And I totally condemn what has happened to Khalid. And I congratulate them because the purpose of their demonstration has been achieved, and Mufaz and the president has cancelled Mufaz's trip to Ramallah.
He's with you, the purpose of your demonstration has been achieved, there's an investigation, all is good.
Well, not exactly. Like, the purpose of our demonstration is not only about the visit of Shaul Mufaz to Ramallah.
It's about Israeli Deputy Prime Minister.
Former Israeli deputy. But it was about the negotiations, and we've been walking in demonstrations against the negotiations in principle.
Negotiations have stopped on the 26th of January 2012. There has been no negotiations since then whatsoever.
But still, President Abbas keeps saying that the only strategy that we're having is negotiating.
Let him say whatever he wants, but on the table there are no negotiations whatsoever since the 26th of January 2012. This is the fact.
I just want to pick up the point Lena was making in part one, and we continued here. You're someone who goes out, you blog, you write, you document Israeli repression at the wall. What do you make of the allegations about Palestinian police and protesters?
Unfortunately, the last few years in the West Bank, the PA has turned the situation into a police state. Now, my take on these protests that happened recently against the Shaul Mufaz's supposed visit to the Muqata in Ramallah was that I feel like the protesters, they kind of played into the hands of what the Israelis wanted. Who leaked the news first? It was the Israelis themselves, because Netanyahu didn't want Mufaz to visit to see President Abbas, and Barak as well. So there's this disagreement even within Israeli internal politics.
Let me pick up on a point Hafiz made about negotiations, and you said the negotiations are over. Over the years, all the talk has been of a two-state solution. Now people talk of a one-state solution. People even talk of a three-state solution. I want to come back to a one-state in a moment. But let me ask you, Nabil, is there a danger that this split between Gaza under Hamas, the West Bank under Fatah, Palestinians living in Israel under Jewish majority rule, and this becomes institutionalized? This is the future. Three different states or statelets.
This is our major responsibility, our responsibility. Of course,
is there a fear of
the
yours?
Israelis are going to do their best to keep us separated. But it is our responsibility and our commitment to continue to negotiate with each other, to continue our dialogue, to end that separation between Gaza and the West Bank. This is a must. We want that unity to come back. And on the 15th of March last year, the young people who demonstrated in the streets, their first call was end the separation, so that we can go back to democracy, so that we can end that situation.
Hafiz and then Samir.
Speaking about March 15th, what we went out for in March 15th, and what we demand, it's not only ending the division. There are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the diaspora, and now in Syria they're facing hard times. In Lebanon they're facing hard times. There are hundreds of thousands of young Palestinians who live abroad, and we're not represented.
Isn't there a danger now that Hamas are perfectly happy with the status quo as well? They've got a tunnel economy, they've got power, they're running things on their own, they're waiting for the new partners in Egypt to help them out. They're going to institutionalize the three-state split, whether we like it or not.
I don't think that any Palestinian who is sincere, and willing, to have a solution to this Palestinian issue and have independent Palestine is, happy with this division. You will find people here in the West Bank and people in Gaza who have been benefited, from this division, benefited, financially, security-wise, politically, and so on. But I don't think that this is the majority here, neither the majority in Gaza.
We've been hearing about national unity talks for more than 5 years, and to be quite frank, we don't believe it anymore. We are sick of hearing about all of this, and we've come to believe that this is a question of self-interest. I want to get back to the issue of representation. I am a Palestinian who's a citizen of Israel. Nobody represents me. Nobody even purports to try to represent me any longer. The PLO no longer looks at the Palestinian citizens of Israel. We are the most discriminated against within the Israeli polity. And yet there's nobody that's coming forward to even purport to try to represent us as individuals.
Well, let me bring Mohammed in on those 2 points. I mean, who represents someone like Diana? And also self-interest. The reason there's this split, there's warm words. You say you want unity, but you go to Doha, you go to Cairo, you go to Riyadh, you have lots of summits. There's no unity government. You're fine with the status quo.
Today we live in a three entities situation. In order for us to move from three entities into a two-state solution, the Palestinian unity is a must, and without it we cannot go anywhere. The problem is, which we don't deny, is that there are external factors that are really playing against this Palestinian reconciliation. External factors, whether it is pressure from Washington, Israel, Iran, whoever is enjoying this sort of, for their own reasons, not for Palestinian reasons. But I think...
Is there a pressure on you to abandon Gaza?
There has been pressure on Abu Mazen not to sign the Cairo agreement, and Abu Mazen said to the Americans, no way I will accept your pressure. And he sent a Palestinian delegation to sign the Cairo agreement, and he himself signed the Doha agreement, and he himself sent another
delegation.
So why
no unity government?
Because Hamas was, because the Palestinian Central Election Commission was supposed to start voters registration by July 2nd, and which is in accordance with the agreement. And then unfortunately Hamas, they didn't allow the CEC, Central Election Commission, to function, which was a prerequisite for the formation of unity government.
Well, I don't think so.
I'll come to you, Lena.
I don't think so. It's the fault of everybody. Hamas and Fatah, they share responsibility. I think it is a must, back to the essence, that we have to have basic human rights respected here in the West Bank and Gaza. It's not an issue of just operating of an election committee here or there. It's a matter of having an atmosphere, of freedom. People have to be freely forming their, parties, doing whatever they like.
Lena, your father's family are from Gaza. What do you make about this? What do you make of this split here? And where do you think responsibility lies for it?
Effectively, Hamas and Fatah, they've hijacked the political scene, both of them. And so it doesn't really interest me if national reconciliation means that Hamas get to kiss and make up. Because effectively what this means is that Hamas and Fatah will get their cake and divide it amongst themselves. Neither Fatah or Hamas represent me. The two-state solution, if I can bring this conversation around to this topic now, it's completely a farce. Why should we as an occupied people concede 78% of our territory? Why should we live on not even 22 of the remaining 22%? I don't even care, how many states come out of this, but what I really want to focus on is achieving human rights. I want the refugees to come back. I want the right of return to be implemented. But this, again, is a problem for Israel, which concerns itself with demography. They can never allow a Palestinian majority to be in Palestine because that, to them, will be the end of a Jewish state.
Nabil, you're listening to Lena saying she wants rights. She wants rights to a land, human rights, and you guys are going and doing UN bids for statehood.
All of what Lena said, I agree to 100%.
And going to the UN for the statehood, which you did last year, is that all part of the same strategy?
That was a strategy to get what she wants. In other words, using international support in order to put pressure on Israel, in order to increase the cost of occupation. That's what it's all about. But I want to go back to that. Yeah. I know the Palestinians in Israel are not represented in the PLO. They are our people, they are Palestinians, but the issue is the Israelis want to kick them all out now. They have not abandoned that. And all of this call about a Jewish state, calling Israel a Jewish state, is to get rid of the 1.5 million Palestinians in Israel. And we cannot help Israel by telling Israel that these are Palestinians and we represent them, and therefore Israel can use that as a claim that there are no more Israeli citizens and kick them out of Palestine.
Do you still believe in a two-state solution?
Of course I do. Of course.
You've
not because it's the most fair, not because it's, but it looked possible.
What's the most fair option?
A one-state solution, a democratic state for all Jews, Christians, and Muslims, for all the Palestinians in the world.
But that's not practical. That's why you don't support it.
It is completely practical.
In 1969, I was the prophet of this democratic state idea. I wrote all the literature.
But you don't support it now because it's not practical.
I still believe in it, but it is not feasible.
It's not feasible.
We are not able
you
to
were a
get
supporter of a
22%.
two-state solution at one time.
Yeah,
You're not anymore.
The question of what's feasible and not feasible, is it more feasible to come and sit down over 20 years trying to get the Israelis to agree to a border? Or is it more feasible to try to get the Israelis to agree to the division of Jerusalem? Or is it more feasible for us to start demanding our rights and start pushing and confronting Israel to give us our rights rather than begging for a little piece of land to be carved out?
Mohammed and then Hafiz.
Today there are 531,000 Jewish settlers living in 185 settlements. A two-state solution is not possible anymore. And I think we are slipping into a one-state situation and not solution, because the one-state solution is not attainable anyhow, in the same way that a two-state solution is not attainable. If the trend of the colonization program continues in the same way that it is happening in 2012, there will be no space for a two-state solution. We will live in a one-state situation because today, remember one important thing.
But it won't be a state. One-state situation, it won't be a state.
Today, we are living in a one-state situation, which is a comprehensive colonization of all of Palestine.
So what you're saying is that will just continue endlessly.
So therefore, what we need to do is that Israel is trying to maintain the status quo. What we want to do is to break this status quo by adopting a new strategy. And the new strategy has to do with popular resistance, has to do with Palestinian unity, has to do with the internationalization of the Palestinian question, has to break...
Is that what the UN bid was about?
Yes, but we have to break the paradigm that has been ongoing since 1993.
Hafiz,
and it is not going anywhere.
Is this encouraging rhetoric?
Not exactly. I think the ones who are supposed to put the strategy is the Palestinian people everywhere. It's only by having the PLO back to its role to represent the Palestinian people.
The Palestine Liberation Organization rather than the Palestinian Authority.
Exactly, and the Palestinian and the PLO and a democratically elected PNC, Palestinian National Council, having everybody would decide the right strategy, because then the Palestinian people would follow.
I agree with you.
Would
even there, the Palestinian citizens of Israel were marginalized.
We agree with
PLO
that.
doesn't claim to represent all Palestinians because from its inception, it excluded the Islamist parties, Islamic Jihad and Hamas. They're not represented by the PLO.
And the Palestinian citizens of Israel
Let
highly
me,
marginalized.
I just need to touch on this one step.
The whole reconciliation is about adding Hamas and Jihad to the Palestine Liberation Organization.
That's still not all of Palestinians.
Let me just deal with this. I'll come to you, Samir, in one moment. I just want to ask Diana a question.
Everybody.
Hold on, Mohammed, 1 second. There's a very respectable, very well-known journalist, Jewish journalist in Britain called Jonathan Friedland, big supporter of the two-state solution. And he wrote recently, he said it's a naive idea. And I want to read a quote he said. He says that two nations that could not negotiate a divorce cannot get married instead.
If you look at the history of this place, there was cohesion. There were Jews, Christians, Christians and Muslims living
There's been
together.
so much violence and hate since.
Yes,
they can now live together in one state.
The root cause of the problem is Zionism, and if you unpackage Zionism, which is exclusive Jewish privilege, then yes, things will be undone. It won't be a perfect situation. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's certainly going to be much more sustainable in the long term, and will be able to guarantee Palestinians their rights.
When Jews in Israel, or Jews globally, hear the phrase one-state solution, especially when they look at Hamas rule in Gaza, they think of we're going to be second-class citizens in a Muslim-majority state where we're going to be treated by Islamist rulers in a very horrible way. How do you allay their fears?
Well, if you go back to history, the Golden Gate, the golden era for the Jews was in Andalusia, and where the Muslims, were having
Hamas
the power
didn't
there.
run Andalusia.
No, I know that. But at the same time, when the situation here allows, for a democratic state where Hamas and Fatah and everybody shares power, I think we will end up with a situation where everybody can live with, in peace and
you think there can be a binational state involving
it's very
Jews,
possible.
Hamas?
I think this discourse or this narrative is the trap that many people fall into, and this is framing this occupation as one of religious strife or religious conflict. That is not the case. I don't have a problem if I live next, I have a Jew as a next-door neighbor. I have a problem if my next-door neighbor is a Zionist. The root cause here, the root problem is Zionism.
Zionists will say I have a problem with an Islamist next to me. This is the problem. It never ends. For example, they'll look at Hamas running Gaza and say that's a supremacist group. That's their perspective.
And so is Israel. If you look at the way that Israel is run today, Israel is
if
run
everyone
by...
is saying this, how do you get around this
today
idea?
Israel's run by
Isn't
Jewish
Nabil right to
supremacists.
say it's not going to happen?
No, absolutely.
Everybody has his own
This is
issue.
The issue is not really, in my opinion, the issue is not really two-state, one state.
Yeah.
The most important issue is that are we in a position as Palestinians to change the dynamics of the struggle in order for us to change the dynamic of the solution?
Absolutely.
And that's a very good point, because that leads me on to something I wanted to ask both of you. Changing the dynamics of resistance.
Exactly.
One of the things we've seen in recent months is the prisoners going on hunger strike, which belatedly, eventually got some global attention. You were one of the people involved in pushing that message out. You designed some of the logos. How big a change do you think this is in the nature of the Palestinian struggle?
When people engage in the political space, in any mean, like in popular resistance or in armed resistance, there will be a change. When the Palestinian prisoners took the decision to confront the Israeli atrocities against them inside the prisons, and the Palestinian people in the streets decided to pack them up, and the Palestinian youth started to invent new actions such as closing the UN headquarters in Ramallah, closing the Red Cross office in Ramallah, then people and media had to pay attention to what's happening.
Do you believe the hunger striking that happened this year, some of the big, what we saw from Khad Adnan onwards and previously, do you think that represents a failure of mainstream politics and therefore people have to take action on their own?
You know, the leadership was not as good as expected to be.
That's the point
to back
he's making.
the hunger strike. We wish to have the Palestinian factions, the Palestinian parties, and the leadership to back our cases.
I still maintain that the hunger striking prisoners have achieved way more what the PA have achieved in 20 years of failed.
And have they achieved
peace
more than Hamas
negotiations.
has achieved as well?
Hamas is still relatively new to this.
But have they supplanted them as the main resistance organisation now? The prisoners at the forefront.
No, I don't think so. This isn't the point. The point here is President Mahmoud Abbas, de facto President Mahmoud Abbas, was quoted in a New York Times article begging Israel to allow him to have more weapons to maintain security because he was afraid that the protests that were taking place on a daily basis in Ramallah would have escalated to something else.
All the talks that Saeb Erekat conducted with Morpho was focused on one single issue, which is release of the prisoners, the 123 Palestinian prisoners who have been kept there before Oslo. So the issue of the prisoners has been really a focus of interest at every level.
Diana shaking her head.
Look,
They only offer to release only 25
Okay, let Diana
prisoners,
respond.
and that's all.
Prisoners have always been a central part of Palestinian people. It's always been part of the struggle. And so I think we'd be wrong to say that people aren't advocating for their release. They are. That's not the major problem. The major problem is that that's only one segment of the society. We have nobody who's advocating for Palestinians who are living in 61% Area C of the West Bank, whose houses are being demolished. Nobody's talking about them. Nobody's talking about the continued settlement activity. Nobody's going and organizing demonstrations to stand in front of these checkpoints or to stand in front of the settlements. Instead, the focus has constantly been on meeting in rooms, shaking hands with Israelis, and having more and more negotiations. It's not sustainable.
Prisoners should have finished, when Oslo Agreement was signed. This is something should have been done behind us long time ago. But once this is, now one of the key issues, we have to insist, that it is part of any settlement that has to be done. But also other issues which are totally kept almost, forgotten. Jerusalem, Al-Quds is a major issue in our hearts, not only the Palestinians, but Arabs, Muslims, the world, the Christians. So we have to invest much of our effort
just come back
to
have
this,
because really the prisoners issue has become and has remained for a very long time a central issue of Palestinian struggle. When we signed Gaza-Jericho, we released 9,000 prisoners, the largest number of prisoners ever released. When Hamas exchanged Shalit, exchanged it for 1,300 prisoners.
Let me ask Hafiz a question. If, so far, thank God, no hunger striker has died, if one of them were to die, what would happen on the Palestinian street here?
We don't want people to die, to start, marching towards the checkpoints. We want to do that according to a national strategy. We want to decide that this occupation has to get to an end. And we want to do that collectively, together.
One other non-violent issue that's often raised, non-violent resistance, is the boycott.
Yes.
Now, big international movement, the boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS. Some people say the boycott movement is more successful outside of the occupied territories than inside the occupied territories. Is that fair? That Palestinians and Palestinian leadership don't give enough support to it?
Oh, in terms of effectiveness, yes, that may be true, that it's more effective outside than it is inside,
But
simply
just
because
of the popular support and discussion as well.
Well, no, it's a question of dependence, and we talked earlier about the
It's not possible.
dependence. It is possible. It's just not.
The
It's not
two
fully.
economies are intertwined.
Yeah, the two economies right now are intertwined. The bigger problem is that the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, the voices of it are coming from outside and not from inside.
Look, President Abbas is the president of the authority as well as of PLO, and he has to really worry very much about the consequences of the boycott, to be met with a boycott from the other side that will close down all the West Bank like the Israelis have closed down Gaza. But Fatah supported the full movement of boycott of all Israeli products.
It's not just a question of goods.
This is the issue.
The authority has been calling for boycotting all settlement products.
Yes, but there's more than settlement products. There's more than
Then who
settlement
makes the
products.
decision? Is it PLO or the Palestinian Authority? If we have one strategy for this specific issue, the boycott, we should all abide with it. We have to boycott the Israelis because
we're running out of time. I
occupation.
just want to ask Mohammed, what would you say to those people who look at President Abbas's record in power up until 2009 and since 3 years without an election and say, objectively, he's been a failure?
I see it totally different. I think there has been a lot of institution building. I think the Palestinian Authority is in shape. I would like to see the Palestinian Authority changing function, as I said earlier. I think the president is not really sticking to his seat. And the most important thing is that this occupation, unfortunately, has been sort of international political shyness when it comes to criticizing Israel. The United States has really gone to the very far right, Europe as well. The Arab countries are now in serious turmoil, transformation, and so on. So the Palestinian cause in general is really facing difficult times. Unfortunately,
Well, Mohammed, let me finish. Very eloquently put their defence. Let me ask all of you, as a last question, do you, each of you, believe that the Palestinian leadership, in its current form, is capable of securing statehood and independence for the Palestinians in the foreseeable future? Yes or no?
The Palestinian people in general, with that leadership, are determined to get that, and they will get it. The question is when and at what cost. But it will happen.
And the leaders, whether Fatah or Hamas, are up to it.
The present leaders and the younger leaders who will come after them will continue that struggle.
Right now, the way that I see it, you've got a leadership that is divided. You've got human rights abuses being committed in the Gaza Strip as well as in the West Bank. We have a self-interested leadership. There is no leadership that represents the Palestinian citizens of Israel. I do, however, look to the future. We do have younger leaders who are emerging, and hopefully we'll be able to be given that space to be able to defend Palestinian rights.
Well, the most positive thing is to restructure, our Palestinian, PNA. Palestinian PNA should be combining West Bank and Gaza, combining everybody under this umbrella, restructuring PLO, and looking for future.
Is it going to happen?
Well, with real intention, yes, it will happen. But if we are self-motivated, it will not.
Lina.
My answer is no. The Palestinian leadership should make the Israeli occupation very costly, and one way to achieve that is by dissolving the PA, so the Palestinians could be under the full security, civil, military control of Israel. This way, people will finally be able to take matters into their own hands. This way, people will finally begin to resist against the occupation and not sit around and comfort themselves with the illusions of state-building institutions, and people will finally form a national resistance strategy, and then peace, and then a country, and then a state, whatever you want to call it, follows.
Hafiz, you joined us late, you get the last word.
Well, I guess the solution for what are we facing now is to have a democratic PLO that decides about the PA. When people are represented, people have the mandate to decide about what they want to do with the PA, what they want to do with the PLO, whether if they want one state, 2 states, 3 states, or if they want to leave to the moon. We have to give the world back to the people.
On that eloquent note, we're going to have to leave discussion here in Ramallah. Thank you very much for your time joining me in the cafe. This debate will continue online. You can join me for another cafe next week.